Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and in this lecture, we are, at long last, going to learn about verbal aspect in Russian. Verbal aspect, as it is practiced in Slavic languages, is not something that we have in English or most Western European languages. We do have all these different tenses in English and Western European languages, especially Romance languages, that Russian doesn't have. But Russian and other Slavic languages express these same concepts or these same basic ideas with their use of verbal aspect. And what does that mean? So most Russian verbs come in pairs or sets, frequently pairs, and these are called aspectual pairs. And so for each action, for each verb, there are actually two verbs for the action. So to read, for example, has two verbs that mean to read. One verb is imperfective and the other is perfective. So they come in these pairs with a imperfective and a perfective verb. Pretty much all the verbs you've learned so far are imperfective and they all have perfective partners. For example, читать, to read, has its perfective partner прочитать. Писать, to write, has its perfective partner написать. And говорить, to speak or say, has its perfective partner сказать. And we will learn more later in the lecture about how aspectual pairs are formed. Let's talk a little bit about imperfective verbs. And again, pretty much all the verbs you know at this point are imperfective verbs. Imperfective verbs emphasize the process of the action, and they are used to indicate action that is ongoing, repeated, unfinished, of long duration, or simultaneous with another action. And imperfective verbs can be used to indicate the past, present, and future, so all three tenses. Some examples could be in детстве я много читала. In childhood or as a child, I read a lot. And we use an imperfective here in the past because we have this ongoing and repeated action. I used to read a lot. I over and over again read a lot, or you could think of it as this action of long duration, but we're looking at a process here. Or я читала книгу и слушала музыку. I was reading a book and listening to music. We have two simultaneous ongoing actions. I was reading a book and listening to music at the same time. Anytime you want to indicate the present tense, you must use an imperfective verb. So we can say, for example, я читаю каждый день. I read every day. And again, if you have the present tense, you must use an imperfective. Only imperfectives can be used in the present. We can also use them in the future, as you learned in the last lecture, with the auxiliary verb of буду, будешь. So, когда мы будем в России, мы будем много говорить по-русски. When we will be in Russia, we will speak Russian a lot. And note that in Russian, when you have two clauses like that, the tenses have to match, so future, future. In English, we'd say, when we're in Russia, we will speak a lot of Russian. In Russian, you must say, when we will be in Russia, we will speak a lot of Russian, future, future. And because we're talking about an ongoing repetitive action of long duration, we use the imperfective. Мы будем много говорить по-русски. Now let's talk about perfective verbs, which are the verbs that we have not encountered yet. Perfective verbs emphasize the result of the action, and they are used to indicate one-time completed actions, consecutive completed actions, and successful actions, so you are emphasizing the result of the action and its success. And perfective verbs can only be used in the past or the future. We cannot use a perfective verb to indicate the present tense. Some examples of using a perfective verb could be Я наконец-то прочитала «Войну и мир». I finally finished reading War and Peace. Читать means that you were reading something. So if you say «Я читала «Войну и мир», that means I was reading War and Peace. There's no indication that you finished. But if we use this perfective form, я прочитала «Войну и мир», that indicates result, the successful completion of the action. I finished reading War and Peace. Or we could say something like «Я прочитала книгу и потом написала эссе о ней». I finished reading the book and then I wrote an essay about it. And we have consecutive successful actions. Result, result. I finished reading the book and then I wrote an essay about it. If we want to use it in the future, we certainly can. All you do is just conjugate it in the non-past, and it indicates a successfully completed action in the future. So, for example, когда ты прочитаешь книгу? When are you going to finish reading the book? Not when are you going to be reading the book. If you said когда ты будешь читать книгу, that means when will you be reading the book? When will you be engaging in the process of reading the book? But when we say когда ты прочитаешь книгу, when are you going to finish reading the book? We are emphasizing the completion of the action. To form the future tense, you can do it in two different ways, depending on whether the verb is perfective or imperfective. So as we learned in the last lecture, to form the future with imperfective verbs, we use the conjugated form of быть plus the infinitive of the imperfective verb. For instance, что ты будешь делать после занятия? What are you going to do after class? Я буду заниматься в библиотеке. I am going to go do homework in the library. And we are talking about process or action where we're not interested in the result. We're interested in how you spend your time. So we say, what are you going to be doing after class? We use imperfective. Что ты будешь делать после занятия? I'm going to be studying in the library. Я буду заниматься в библиотеке. If, however, we want to indicate a completed or successful action, we are going to use a perfective verb and we just conjugate it in the non-past, and that tells us it's the future. For instance, куда ты пойдешь после занятия? Where are you going to go after class? Пойти is perfective. Я пойду в магазин и куплю новую книгу. I'm going to go to the store and buy a new book. All the verbs in these sentences are perfective because we are emphasizing completed, successful, one-time consecutive actions. Куда ты пойдешь после занятия? Я пойду в магазин и куплю новую книгу. Finally, let's talk about how aspectual pairs are formed. There are four basic ways that aspectual pairs are formed. The first is prefixation. This is probably the most common way that aspectual pairs are formed. With prefixation, the imperfective is the base verb, and then we form the perfective by adding a prefix. So, for example, читать becomes прочитать, писать becomes написать. And these prefixes often have meaning that slightly changes or adds to the meaning of the verb. For example, pro, the prefix pro with a verb means doing something through or all the way through. So читать is to be reading and прочитать is to read all the way through. The second way to form an aspectual pair is through infixation. With this method, the perfective is the base verb, and it frequently is a perfective with a prefix already. And then we form the imperfective by adding an infix, so something in the middle of the verb, and normally that infix is uva or iva. And any o in the middle of the verb often becomes a. So for example, заказать, to order, becomes заказывать. We add uva to form the imperfective. Опоздать, to be late, becomes опаздывать. And we add uva, and we also turn that middle o into a. And again, this is very commonly done with a perfective verb that has already been formed with a prefix. So, for example, with the verb заказать, казать is sort of a base verb, And then we can create all kinds of meanings for it by adding various prefixes, turning it into various perfective verbs, and then we create their imperfectives by adding this iva infix. So we take kazat, their base verb, we make it perfective by adding za, we get zakazat to order, and then we need an imperfective, and we add iva zakazivat. So that is how that works. Another somewhat less common, but still fairly common way to form aspectual pairs is through a stem change. And normally what this means is that we have a first conjugation verb for the imperfective, and it becomes a second conjugation verb in the perfective. For instance, pakupat, to buy, is first conjugation, and then kupit, the perfective, is second conjugation. Poluchat, to receive, in the imperfective, is first conjugation. Poluchit, the perfective, is second conjugation. Postupat, to apply to school, imperfective, is first conjugation. Postupit, to get into school, perfective, so we have process versus result, is second conjugation. And finally, there are a few aspectual pairs that are formed from completely different verbs. This is not very common at all, but there are a handful of pairs of very important verbs where this is how it's done. For example, gavarit, to speak or say, becomes skazat in the perfective. And note how that's formed from that kaza verb root. We've added sa, make it perfective, and we have skazat is the perfective of gavarit. Or brat, the imperfective of to take, is vziat in the perfective. And those are the main verbs in that group that you want to know right now. Again, be aware that this is a small but very important group of verbs. And there you have your introduction to verbal aspect. Some of you might be completely overwhelmed. Some of you might be thinking, oh gosh, this is so easy. Like, how can this possibly be hard? In some ways, it is very easy. There are many fewer endings to memorize than, for example, all the different tenses in Romance language verbs. But conceptually, it is actually very challenging for English speakers. And so as we continue working with verbal aspect, we will learn some guidelines for when to use which aspect, which will be helpful for you. And seeing it being used regularly will also be very helpful. And you just have to keep exposing yourself to it and becoming more and more familiar with it. And with that, we will finish off Chapter 9. There's another little section in Chapter 9 with a chart at the bottom of page 333 of all the question words and pronouns in all the cases. I highly recommend that you go look at that chart at the bottom of page 333 and memorize all those forms. I decided we don't need a lecture for it because it's just a chart that you need to memorize. So with that, we will finish up Chapter 9.